Good afternoon, everyone, or it's afternoon in London. Um, my guest today is back. Actually, we did a podcast on art business about 12 months ago. Anindo Sen, welcome, Anindo. What time is it where you are? And can you tell us where you are?
Yeah, I'm based in Bangalore right now in India, and it's around 8:30 in the evening.
In the evening, which is why you said good evening when we met before the podcast started.
Right.
But it's afternoon here, so it's not too bad a time difference.
Yeah.
And before
Um,
before I continue, I just wanted to welcome listeners back to the Art Business Podcast. It's been several months since I've recorded one, and I thought now it's the new year, it's time to go for it again. So welcome back, everyone, and I hope I'm sure it'll be well worth the wait. And I've got some very exciting guests to follow up later in the year. As Anindo's already said, he's based in India and currently in Bangalore, and this podcast is very much about what's going on in India from Anindo's viewpoint as someone who's actually based in India. So I was just going to start, Anindo, with asking you whether you could give us a brief overview of the Indian art market.
yeah. So I think it's good to start with a disclaimer. I don't profess to be an expert on the market, but yes, I'm closer to the ground and I closely track what's happening in the market and the wider art ecosystem. And it's an area of interest for me, both for my writing as well as for my research. So I think that's what I would like to share. That's where I will be coming from. The second part is also that the Indian art market is an emerging art market, and there's a lot that is growing and getting molded as we speak. So I think expertise is overrated in any case because the variables are changing, things are scaling up, and there's a lot of dynamism. So I think those two things kept in mind, with an open mind, we can always uh, discuss the market. So I think in terms of overview, I don't want to get too much into the historical aspect or the art history aspect because that's a separate thing in itself. But just to put the context, uh, art does not exist in isolation. It is part of a certain society and a certain culture and a certain political context. And I think India has had a long and unbroken tradition of art and culture, a rich cultural tradition, and which has experienced close intermingling cultural exchanges with both the West and the Far East over millennia. So I think it has a strong, in a modern context or a current context, a very strong national cultural context, but it also has a very hybrid cultural context and the art that has been created. So the cultural producers over the millennia, over the centuries, I think have borrowed from that, have expressed their context in that in for that period and era. And I think so if you look at from the ancient to medieval period, obviously in one broad sweep, similar to the ancient Greeks, I know David that you it's a favorite subject of yours and your PhD as well, Greek and Roman history. So we also had a lot of sculpture. That was the predominant material media that was used, and a lot of it can be seen in temple architecture. So I think we can't get into detail on anything, but I'll mention these things in passing. So if listeners want to understand any of this better, there is Google to the rescue. You can explore further, and if you have access to libraries, you can read up on books on the subject. But I think a good way to understand ancient Indian sculpture is to either visit India and visit these sites or read about temple architecture. Uh, and then there were also, I understand in the West, the perspective on art, especially pre-modern, is more focused on painting, especially not pre-modern, yeah. So Renaissance period onward. So in India, you had a lot of murals. Again, religious in context. I think Ajanta and Ellora are the two standout cave murals which have survived, especially Ajanta. And but the main manifestation of painting was actually very different from the West, which was more in the form of miniature paintings, which was mainly patronized by the royal courts before the British came in. And you had different schools, like you had the Rajasthani school, you had the Mughal school, you had the Pahari school, you had and in the south you had the Deccan school. So these are And they were not in isolation. So, it's like they influenced each other. So when the Mughals came in, they obviously fought some of these kingdoms, co-opted some of these kingdoms, and there was a lot of synergy. So, for example, you could have a Hindu artisan or an artist working in the Mughal court. So he brought in a certain aspects of the culture that was part of his lived experiences in terms of techniques, in terms of motifs, and you can see a very hybrid form of art in most styles when we are talking about this. And the other is, of course, architecture. So architecture, like in the UK also you had Gothic, etc. and all. A lot of architecture was closely fused with art forms at that time, and especially because I said art in India had a three-dimensional component in terms of sculpture, fused with temple architecture, friezes, etc. So I think that's a it's not comprehensive, it's not representative, but these are some of the highlights. I think if we look at till about 1700 or 1750, then I think the British came over, they colonized us. And at that point, one of the forms that came up is what we call the company school, or the East India Company patronized painting. In fact, there was a very interesting exhibition called Forgotten Masters. I think that was the name of the exhibition. It happened at the Wallace Collection in 2019. So if some of you listeners were there in London at that time, might have visited it. And so basically what happened is a lot of these artisans were earlier patronized by the Mughal courts or the Rajput courts, etc. But when the British came in, they lost their patrons. And for example, the court of Awadh, which is now Lucknow, so when they were defeated by the British, so some of these, and the British were trying to, as colonizers, they were trying to figure out an alien geography and alien culture, and they wanted to document. And there's a lot to critique about it, but from a specific art history point of view, I think a lot of these artists found commissions and patrons in the British colonizers, and a certain style, academic, watercolor based, which was in sync with what was happening there at that time. An interesting outlier is somebody is Zoffany, Johann Zoffany, who actually was an artist of fortune who came to India, who thought he might get a lot of good commissions. And there are some paintings by him from the early colonial era, so 1770s, 80s, that exist. In fact, I've seen his work at the National Gallery in London as well. So I think that is the kind of art that was and then I think in the what would be the peak Victorian era, so 1880s, 90s, around that time in India, the seeds of nationalism were being sown, and India was starting to believe that we should get our independence back. I think the first standout artist who still remains a standout is somebody named Raja Ravi Verma, who fused Western oil painting techniques with Indian cultural motifs, and he drew gods and goddesses and other scenes from mythology, etc., which are masterpieces, each one of them. And I think he's the standout from that era. Then in the early 20th century, you had the Bengal school. So what happened is 1900, 1905, that was the period when the freedom movement really took off. And Bengal, which was Calcutta was still the capital of the British. They moved to Delhi in 1911. Uh, but around that time is when a lot of artists and the cultural arbiters, poets, writers, etc., they started talking about the need for a national identity, the need for a artistic language, etc. And that's when the Bengal movement came about. And they basically rejected the academic school, which was, sort of uh, at that point being, sort of promoted by the British. And for about 15, 20 years, they were the ones who sort of held fort in terms of the national psyche from an art perspective. And then I think more modern values and aesthetics and styles also started coming in. So India got independence in 1947. So before that, you had like the standout artist is probably Amrita Shergill, who's now I might talk about her later as well if she comes up in context. But here I'm just trying to summarize and set a context to the art story of India. So she was the standout artist, Amrita Shergill. She died very young, I think at the age of 28. But she was very precocious. She went to Paris to learn, I think at the age of 15 or 16, and even though she died young, uh, there's no there's not a sizable body of work, but there is enough paintings really high, of the highest order. So she's there. Then you had others like Nandalal Bose, Abdul Rahman Chugtai, and then when we got independence around that time, the group, at that time, manifestos were in vogue. The first half of the 20th century, group of artists got together, wrote manifestos. So the Bombay Progressives group, progressive artist group, who we generally refer to as the Bombay Progressives, because they started out in Bombay. So people like Souza, Raza, M.F. Hussain, Ara, they sort of got together and they rejected the Bengal school, and they wanted, sort of post-independence, they had a fresh approach. The group per se lasted not too long because some of them migrated. Like Souza, I think Souza moved to the UK, Raza moved to France, M.F. Hussain stayed back. But I think, and some of the other junior artists, joined that group. So these are the key sort of groups that were there. Bombay Progressives, while it was not long lasting, but it has had a lasting impact in terms of even today, some of the highest prices in auctions are commanded by that group. I think in terms of the key constituents, in terms of auction houses, uh, surprisingly, you have very strong auction houses in India, domestic. So I think Saffron Art, which we've studied as a case study, which actually went the other way. It started as an online art auction and then pivoted to also a physical auction house. Then you have the Pundoles and you have Astaguru. So these are the auction houses. Sotheby's and Christie's have tried their luck, but they have sort of not succeeded. Christie's has a longer history. They did auctions in Mumbai, I think about 10 years back. They were doing auctions 2013, 14, 15, that period. And they had decent results. But I think global priorities, uh, same thing with Sotheby's. Sotheby's did their first auction in 2018. But I think what has happened is ownership has changed. They are privately held. Their priorities have also changed. I think my sense is that they primarily focus on the Western collector and the diaspora collector for Indian art, and they are able to access them much better sitting in the New York auctions or the London auctions. I think to target the Indian collector, it's a much bigger challenge for them. There are entry barriers. I think Saffron Art, Pundoles, Ashtaguru, they have ring fenced it much better. So I think uh, so that's and Christie's, I think, is focusing more on Hong Kong, going by reports, because that's their entry point to Asia. Um, and I think yeah, so that's in terms of galleries. You have, so in India, the highest concentration of galleries is in Delhi and Mumbai. So if somebody is wanting to get a sense of the Indian art market, these are the two cities to visit. Of course, the art fairs, you have Delhi Art Fair. We'll probably speak about it later, which is now, it's almost 15 years old. And the Mumbai Art Fair, which started last year. So these are the two places where you'll see aggregation of galleries. It's the easiest way to meet everybody together. Otherwise, you can come to any of these cities and sort of do spend some time visiting the exhibitions. Delhi is more conservative. It has more of modern art galleries, like the Delhi Art Gallery, etc. And you have contemporary art galleries also, like Nature Morte. Bombay has both. The Bombay collector base is more open to uh, contemporary art, and you have a lot more contemporary art galleries in Mumbai. So you have galleries like K Mold, which is one of the distinguished galleries. It's completing 60 years this year. I mean, last year. It's in its 60th year. Then you have Experimenter, which started about 15 years back in Calcutta. Now it's opened one outpost in Mumbai. You have Chatterjee and Lal. You have Zaveri Contemporary. You have younger galleries like Turk and Akara. Akara has both modern and contemporary galleries. You have Project 88. You have many others. But in terms of concentration, these are the two cities. The other main cities have one or two uh, preeminent galleries in their geography. But for contemporary art, especially, Bombay is the preferred destination, and these are the two places. So I think that's a brief overview of this. And I think I just mentioned the market size. So I think in the Indian art market, in terms of size, so the first, I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt because the art market is very opaque and most of the players are private. So there are no reporting requirements which are legally mandatory, both in India as well as globally. So I also don't give a lot of credence beyond a point to the global art market size, which like it's been around 65 billion forever, other than pandemic distortions, etc. But coming back to, so there's this state of the Indian art market that got published, and they have been publishing this for a while now. So I think it can be considered to be relatively credible. They reported that the auction market was about 144 million USD, which I think that is the reported, sort of more trackable or sort of that can be validated. So I think that's one slice of the market, and this is an all-time high. The previous occasion when it reached that level was before the Lehman Brothers crash, which is when the Indian art market has really boomed and went bust after that.
We're
So,
talking about
but it again, the
2000.
qualifier here is that the Indian rupee has depreciated probably by 60-70% since in the last 15 or 20 years. So, 144 million today and 144 million then is different. So, but it's 144 million, and about 75 to 80% actually is modern art. So the contemporary art, uh, in terms of lots, it is growing, and it is, say, for example, the number of lots could be 20-25%, but in terms of value, it is still less than 5%. Because if we get a chance later to talk about the artists, we can talk about who's doing how in auctions. But in terms of the market components, it's mostly dominated by moderns. And then you have pre-moderns. Pre-moderns are people who were born before, sort of the Amrita Shergill, etc. that I was talking about, the Bengal school, things like that. So pre-moderns will be another 10%. So 80 to 90%, 95% is actually these, and contemporary art is still a small part, but it is the most exciting, most dynamic part of the market, which we will come to later. So I think that's my overall summary for the Indian art market.
And when you were talking about that amount of 150 million, that's
right,
just
ballpark 150 million.
That's just from published auction houses rather than private treaty sales.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think in terms of size, we also must understand, sorry, David.
No, I was just going to say you might typically, certainly from the Western viewpoint of the art market, someone like Claire McAndrew in the Art Market Report, she would tend to say that the private treaty sales in auction houses have really grown over the last 20 years. So they're like 60% of their sales now seem to be private treaties. So you could suggest that there's probably another 150 to 200,000 pounds in the private sector and the private treaties.
Yeah. So the only thing I would qualify is that the dynamics of the Indian market are not the same as the dynamics of the Western market. It's obviously not as mature, and the auction houses bring in the big ticket value sales because like there's a huge arbitrage between primary market sales and auction house tertiary sales.
Yes.
And also because in India, the number of artists whose works are well documented and there's a great chain of provenance, etc., is relatively lower. Like India is a 5,000-year-old country in terms of history, but it has a art history of less than 100 years, for example.
Yes.
So, and very few artists got the validation till about 20-30 years back. So it's only starting now. So because of that, the auction houses, I think, get those big ticket sales. But your point is valid. There, one can make assumptions and work out a smart guesstimate. But I'm not conjecturing that right now because for me, that's not as important. What is more important to understand is the variables, is the dynamics, the trends, and sort of those factors.
And from if you like, if I can represent a Western viewpoint, when I started really recognizing the names during that potted history of the India and the art world in India, I had been to the Wallace Collection exhibition, which was amazing, and it was obviously this was part of a movement towards looking at a post-colonial critique and looking at sort of what was happening with British colonization of India and the way art reflected that. And it was a fantastic, very, very interesting exhibition. And of course, a lot of those works, it reminds me of antiquity, where the Romans invade Greece and the artists remain Greeks, but the Romans become new patrons. So that seemed to me to be what was going on in India at the time. Suddenly you've got similar artists and maybe in the same tradition of apprentice and master, but suddenly they're working for a new patron, or a lot of their work is now for the British patrons. And hence, I guess the reason why, as in that exhibition, you're looking at portable works of art that can be taken back to Great Britain by those patrons. Whereas in earlier in Indian history, you're often looking at less obviously portable works like Indian miniatures, and although they're small, they're not meant to be passed around, as it were, and also your cave paintings and so on. So I guess that's the moment that you began to get more of Indian art moving around the world, or certainly to the Britain. And I think that the first names I think myself and probably most listeners will recognize from auctions in, say, London and New York are definitely the moderns. Sousa and Raza are now very, very familiar names to us, because we see their names coming up at auction. We see relatively high prices for their work. Presumably those works are often selling to, do you know anything about, it would be interesting to know what proportion of those works, and obviously we won't know the exact number, but do you have any instinct for how many of those are selling to what we used to call NRIs, the non-resident Indians, and how many to traditional Western buyers?
So first, it's difficult to put a number, because first of all, art is very illiquid, and works come up in auction after a long period. And the second thing is the auction houses are not really very transparent about who's buying the work. So I think anything that I say will be, an assumption-based guess, which I will avoid. Absolutely. But it suffices to say that conversations with gallerists suggest that the diaspora has, taken an active interest in collecting Indian art. And there are many, like if you see Komal Shah, who primarily collects women artists. There are Indian diaspora collectors who are becoming more and more recognized. And even within South Asia, there are collectors who, like Kiran Nadar, who's the chairperson and founder of the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, or the Samdanis, who are based in Bangladesh. Now, a lot of them are now globally recognized collectors.
Yes.
And things like that. So I think both diaspora as well as domestically in India, you have a lot of collectors who are, and I think it's the financial muscle as well as the passion for collecting art, which when they come together, I think there is, and goes without saying, the diaspora has been behind the rise of Indian modern and contemporary art in the West. That one can say, without any doubt. But how many have bought, what percentage in terms of value, it's a more difficult one to answer.
But what you've just said, I think, is probably mainly true. That the diaspora is the one. It's the fact that there are diaspora Indians from the diaspora, as it were, who are living in the traditional Western countries and are very wealthy. We're probably talking about ultra high net worth individuals now, because we all know that social group in India has made a lot of money. And maybe we could talk about that later. Has there been a growth since the start of the pandemic in the number of HNWIs and UHNWIs, the ultra high net worth individuals? Is that something?
I think, so I think I'll discuss this in the context of the art market.
Sure.
So I think obviously the Indian art market has been growing since the start of the pandemic. And so in terms of the trajectory, I think between 95 and 2008 is when the Indian art market took off.
Yes.
Especially in the period between 2000 2008, and more specifically 2004 to 2008. But after that, the contemporary art market, which was fueled by a lot of speculation, really crashed. And I think the 10 years after that were a period of consolidation and steady growth. And it's only after the pandemic it's really grown. So I think there are certain things that are intrinsic to the market, but I think the India as an economy has been growing very well, and it is expected to grow, continue to grow, because it has a large population, it has a young workforce, which means a very dynamic workforce, and there's a large population of skilled and English speaking workforce. So all this adds up to, sort of potential. And both the manufacturing and the service sectors, which is like IT, have been firing well in the recent years. And the government has been investing in a lot of infrastructure, which further catalyzes growth. So I think all this is adding up. And from a long-term perspective, in fact, I wrote about it in the ArtNet article that I wrote on the Art Mumbai, that in the it's been widely reported that in the next 3 to 4 years, India will become the third largest economy after the US and China. And India is already as big or marginally bigger economy than the UK. So it in terms of size as an economy, it has a long way to go to catch up with China. That's a different discussion. But if you're comparing countries other than the US and China, India is a large economy. It's just that it has more mouths to feed. It
Yeah.
has 20 times the population of the UK, but the
Yeah.
same economic size. So I think that's where. So I don't think India's. So that's there. And like Mumbai, for example, you outside of US and China, Mumbai has the most number of billionaires,
Yeah.
uh, other than London and Singapore. So,
Yes.
for example, if you take Miami or Dubai or Paris, which are high-profile art fair destinations, Mumbai has more billionaires than these cities. And yes, of course, one can say that if an art fair is happening in Miami, billionaires from all across the US come and attend it. So they have a much bigger catchment area. But it is also important to cognize for the fact that Mumbai as a city, in its own way, is an economic powerhouse. And you were asking me about trends. So yes, it's been growing, the number of uh, millionaires, but also like that same report that I'm referring to, they tracked something called centimillionaires, which is people with investable assets of 100 million centimillionaires. And they said that in Mumbai, in the next 10 years, that number will go up by 80%,
Wow.
which is one of the highest amongst all global cities.
Yes.
So even now, even if it is, sort of not in the top 3 or 5, if it grows by 80%, it is likely to, compete with a lot of top cities in the world. So I think these are things that, as an economy, there are clear indicators that there is an increase in the number of high net worth individuals. And what is also happening is some of it is going into collecting, but a lot of it is also seeping into arts philanthropy.
Oh.
Uh, and I think if we get an opportunity, we'll talk about that in this podcast. I think that's a very important thing to cognize for, because the potential there is also very huge. So I
The,
think, yeah,
Anindo, in terms of sorry to interrupt. In terms of generations, we've heard a lot about on studies of billionaires and the increase in
right,
billionaires
right.
from all over the world, at least in the major economies. That we're hearing that a lot of the my generation, like the boomer generation, are now retiring and passing on a lot of wealth to younger members of the family, who themselves are now beginning to buy art. And that may be something to do with the reason why you're beginning to get more interest in contemporary, ultra contemporary over the last few years. Can you see, so maybe in a nutshell, you could say something about, because I've only really witnessed the diaspora buying interest in Indian art in say London at auction in particular. But
Right.
would you say a lot of is there a growth in the big cities such as Mumbai and Delhi? Is there a growth in the number of people who are staying there and maybe collecting art? And is it a signifier of social status and or wealth? And are they creating art foundations? And what about the generations? Is there an interest in younger wealthy people in collecting art, as if you like, as a status symbol or as a symbol of their lifestyle?
So I think I see it slightly differently when we look at wealth. So again, I think India is on a different trajectory and maturity in term as an economy
Mm-hmm.
compared to the West.
Hmm.
So we have to recognize for the fact that when the British left India in 1947, it left India very impoverished.
Hmm.
The only people who had money were people who had, uh, sort of who were the princely states, people with a sort of a royal background or a quasi-royal background, part of the royal court, or people who had, let's just say, who were obsequious to the British, who worked for them, sort of grease their palms through that process.
Yes.
So, the vast majority of India was left impoverished. The vast majority of India was agrarian. And that is where the growth story started. But till 1990, India was a very, not a communist, but it was a socialist economy,
Hmm.
uh, more based on the principles that, say, Russia used to follow. We used to have 5-year plans like them, and the industries were very highly regulated. Sort of there was a lot of licensing involved. There were a lot of limits to how fast a company could grow or an industry could grow. The foreign investment was curtailed. So I think India's real growth story starts only from 1991 when the economy was liberalized and opened up.
Mm.
So what you see, so when we talk about wealth, there are different, and we have to classify. Yes, there is intergenerational wealth, and then there is also self-made wealth.
Hmm.
And I think in India, the second story is much more powerful. And the third dimension that I will talk, there are a few more, but I think we'll stick to these three because there's a lot that we can talk about in the Indian art market, whether it's the museums, the galleries, the art fairs, etc. So I'd rather focus on that. So I think intergenerational wealth, yes, it is being passed on, but there's a significant increase in the number of self-made millionaires and billionaires in the last 20 years. Because since 1991, when it opened up, there are large sectors like the financial industry has just exploded, and Mumbai has been the sort of pivot. Similarly, the IT industry, of which Bangalore, the city where I'm based in, is the nerve center, has really exploded and created this large pool of self-made rupee millionaires and billionaires, for example. And then came the startup ecosystem in the last 10 years, where, sort of from IT services, which was growing and has continued to grow and has scaled up, you've had a lot of startups where people have, sort of made money. So I think that is the set of people, the young people who have, sort of who have through entrepreneurial zeal made money. And the other thing, and the third one that I spoke about is the diaspora. So one thing people don't realize is how large. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Uh, yeah, I think so. One of the things people don't realize is that India actually has a diaspora of almost 18 to 20 million,
Hmm.
which is like the largest population. It's like the size of a mid-sized European country, probably.
Yeah.
And they're spread all over the world, and they're becoming richer and more influential. So you take the US, for example. They're the highest per capita income demographic in terms of migrant groups.
Hmm.
And the current vice president is partly of Indian origin. The head of Google and Microsoft are of Indian origin.
Yes, sure.
So the thing is, so these three, and so each one has its own sphere of influence, financially and culturally, and it's all adding up. But coming back to intergenerational wealth that you said, there's a lot of uh, large business conglomerates which were founded either in the 60s or 70s or post independence era, which grew in a regulated environment till the 1980s. And then post liberalization, they really scaled up. And now they are passing their businesses to the next generation. And in
Sure.
some cases, there is a third generation that is now stepping up.
Sure.
So these people obviously, and we can talk about, for example, we'll talk about the Ambanis, and they have opened up a cultural center last year, so we can talk about that. We can talk about so for example, there's the Piramals, there's the Ambanis, there's the Nadars. These are large business houses which are first generation, second generation, or third generation, uh, and they're all dollar billionaires. So you
Hmm.
take the Ambanis, for example, who are the richest Indian family as of now. Depends on the share prices, keeps going up and down, but Mukesh Ambani, for example, is in the top 10 in the Forbes billionaire list usually,
Yeah.
and his wealth is, I think, is in the range of about 100 billion,
Yes.
which is actually in the same range of as, say, a Bill Gates or a Warren Buffett, or even Jeff Bezos post divorce. So I
Yeah.
think it's around 100 to 120 billion is the value of their wealth as reported.
Yeah.
So I think there is a lot of scale. Similarly, the Nadar family, who Kiran Nadar, who is the founder of the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, KNMA,
Hmm.
which is founded in 2010, I think. So her husband, Shiv Nadar, is the founder of HCL Tech, which is one of India's largest IT companies.
Hmm.
And I think his wealth will be in the range of 25 to 30 billion. So
Hmm.
this is the kind of wealth, and they are India's largest art collectors.
Yeah.
And their collection is what has, sort of uh, led to these public art museums that we're talking about, the KNMA in Delhi, or the Nita Mukesh Ambani Cultural Center, NMACC in Mumbai, which is opened last year. So there is a clear connection between wealth generation leading to private philanthropy, or legacy creation leading to public art centers or museums or galleries.
So that because one of the things that the more sociological studies of buyers on the art market has pointed out through interviews and surveys is that the millennial generations tend to be more philanthropic. So they're
Yeah,
collecting art. They don't like
right,
they don't like to be labelled as collecting art for purely for investment. They see
right,
themselves as wanting to do more with their art collections than maybe earlier generations typically had done.
right. I think there the other qualifier that I'll add is that as India is getting richer and a lot of the population is younger, yes, income disparity is going up because it's a capitalist consumerist model,
Mm.
unfortunately. But the number of rich is growing and the number of young rich is growing.
Yes.
And a lot of them are, so we live in an extremely interconnected, globalized world. And
Hmm.
a lot of them are traveling abroad very frequently for work or holiday. And many of them, especially the next generation, are also studying abroad. So
Yeah.
their outlook, their taste, and their art preferences are increasingly globalized.
Yes.
So when they're coming back, a lot of them, I think, are more interested in art than somebody who's only lived in India,
Sure.
because they have been exposed. He or she has been exposed to
Yeah.
art in museums, art fairs, galleries,
Yeah.
when they visit people's houses. So I think that is also triggering that. The other thing is, in India, India is also in the middle of a real estate boom. So if I look at the last couple of years, real estate companies have been financially outperformers,
Hmm.
and that is expected to continue. And because of that, as you build more homes, obviously there's more walls,
Yeah.
and there is, I mean, the art market tends to glorify the activity of buying art as just collecting, but the truth is everybody starts decorating their house and at some point graduates to a collector who collects for the love of collecting. So I think in the initial phase of growth, I think the real estate market and housing boom is also an important factor.
I think it's really interesting, and we can see that throughout art history, can't we? That the again the Romans traditionally at least labelled themselves as not being into art, and at the
Right.
moment they started conquering Greek cities in southern Italy, Sicily, and then Greece itself, they were taught about the arts by so that they're going abroad to a certain extent, albeit in a more aggressive way. But it's those people that become the big art collectors, the ones who happen to be a Roman governor in Greece or the Eastern Mediterranean, who tend to then
Right.
become the big art collectors. And those who don't go to those places outside of Rome and Italy, people like Cicero, uh, they rely on agents who are working in those places and their taste and their understanding of art to decorate their villas in Rome and Italy. So it's probably a similar thing going on. And as I understand it, the priorities as someone gets more wealthy are they buy their house, they buy their car, and then their refrigerator is very important. And then after that, art, they want to decorate their walls. So I think that is something that's often overlooked, I think, by those of us studying the art market. The number, I mean, I tell my students when you're in Sotheby's, if you go to previews on your own and listen to potential collectors, not professional collectors or foundation collectors or museum collectors, but just like ordinary people with just wanted to decorate their house. If you listen to them talking, it really is like choosing a color paint for your wall. Oh, I like the pink Andy Warhol because it'll go with my wall, with the color of that room. So we forget that an art has often been very, very much about that, even from the Medici palaces, where they're really wanting to decorate a lot of the walls of their rooms. So it doesn't have a huge social meaning in a public sense, if you like. And I just while I'm thinking about it, just to continue that story. So in that period you rightly referred to, between say 95 and 2008. That was something that I witnessed as well, and I began to see contemporary Indian artists. They became big names. The obvious ones, Bharti Kher and Subodh Gupta. And I remember seeing their works appearing for sale at Sotheby's auctions in 2007, 2008, when the art market was at its height.
Right.
And people were, Western buyers, I think, were also really interested in buying their work. And what was interesting, it was in that sculptural tradition rather than painterly tradition that you talked about as always been part of Indian art. So, and then after the Lehman Brothers crash in September 2008, you're quite right. The same was happening with Chinese contemporary art, and art from other emerging economies, if you like, at that time. And then they also disappeared. Suddenly their markets crashed, as I understand it, with the Chinese contemporary artists, as they did to a certain extent with the Indian contemporary artists. And then since the crash of 2008, I guess it'd be quite interesting for you to go into a little bit more detail about the dynamics of the art market and why people started then collecting more. Maybe it's a more conservative trend to go for the classic modern artists like Sousa and Raza.
So I think there were two problems with the Indian art market when it really boomed. One is that you had a lot of speculators coming in.
Sure.
People speculating on the asset rather than collecting long term, which is never a good thing for the market.
Absolutely.
And that focus was more on the contemporary side.
Yeah.
And what was happening is, because the contemporary art was getting a lot of buzz. So, for example, you mentioned Subodh Gupta, Francois Pinault at the Venice Biennale at his Palazzo Grassi, sort of put out Subodh Gupta's work as the showcase. And validation like that sort of really sort of piqued a lot of collectors. And I don't want to compare because they're two different things, but the way crypto happened and NFT art happened, and speculators just latched onto it.
Yep.
A similar thing happened on Indian art because people thought that this is one non-Western form of art, which I think can take off.
Yep.
And they were buying ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
So that was an issue. The second issue with Indian art was that, and it's a challenge even today, is the lack of documentation, is the lack of archiving, and the lack of provenance, a watertight provenance, because of which I think a lot of art market participants took advantage in like we say, an unregulated opaque market where there is no proper price discovery, there's no proper transparency, and sold a lot of fakes. And I think that really created a bad reputation, and that happened in the masters, the moderns, etc. also.
Yeah.
So because of which, what has happened, and people realized that was an issue. So as a result, what happens is a lot of serious collectors don't want to touch works or artists where they are concerned about. So if there's no catalog raisonné, for example, and there is no sort of long-standing scholarship about the artist's work, a lot of that has changed in the last 10 years. But we are talking about that period which you mentioned, 95 to 2008. So I think those are the needs. We once you have, so what has happened from 2008 to now, the market has grown steadily, it has consolidated. The bigger names therefore have done well. So if you see in the last 2-3 years, and those very names, Guy Tonde, Tab Mehta, Souza, Hussain, Bakre, then Amrita Shergill, who achieved the highest ever. Her painting, The Storyteller, sold for about 7.5 million USD September last year at Saffron Art. So and all these names that I mentioned, the standout works by them. So for example, Taib Mehta's Mahishashura Mardini series. which is basically a specific mythology context work. That series, it has created records, large works, Gaitonde's abstract works. So these are, and especially when they come with a higher quality provenance. For example, the Glenbara Museum of Japan, uh, the founder was one of the early uh, collectors of Indian art. Uh,
Mm.
so, so I think a lot of Westerners and say the Japanese, they a lot of them came as expats, diplomats, or businessmen working in India, and they picked up Indian art sort of as a souvenir. I don't think they were even thinking of collecting initially. I
Yes.
think it just started as, I'm living in India, I'm working in India, I love Indian culture, so I must have some Indian art in my home. And
Yep.
I think from there, the love and passion grew. And by the time they left, they had a sizable collection. And even after they went back to their countries, they continued to collect. And at that time, Indian art was very cheap.
Yep.
And a lot of those collections are now coming back into auctions. And they
Yes.
have a relatively cleaner provenance because sometimes they procured it directly from the artist or from the gallery who sort of sold the artist. And that is where I think it's becoming more robust now, the Indian art market today. For example, you buy from a gallery, you'll clearly get a letter of authenticity, you'll
Sure.
get a chain of provenance. So those things are not issues anymore in the primary market.
Yes.
It is the secondary and the tertiary market where one has to be careful. And
Yes.
therefore, it's the individual's choice, the gallery he visits or the art advisor he or she they work with. So I think the market is learning. But if I have to say the gallerist perspective, I think the gallerists are relatively far more uh, conservative when it comes to allowing any scope for speculation.
Sure.
In auction houses, obviously the price discovery is transparent. So if two people bid, it can go wherever. But I think the key takeout from 2023 is that most top modern artists, when they came to auction, and if the work was uh, 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 a prominent one in terms of the period and the subject, they hit records, all-time records. And that is because such works are relatively rare,
Yeah.
especially along with a good provenance.
Yeah, it's not
So that is,
dissimilar, therefore, to the reasons why any works have been selling well over the last few years. From not from non-living artists in particular, or classic modern
right.
living
The
artists. Yeah.
only other aspect that I would like to add, which is relatively unique to the Indian art market, is that the Indian government has named 9 artists as national treasures,
Ah.
includes Amrita Shergill, for example, Rabindranath Tagore, etc. So these artists, their works cannot be taken out of India.
Ah. Yes.
So when they are sold in auction in India, to me, the price is also an artificial function
Yep.
of this factor.
Yep.
So if an Amrita Shergill sold for 7.5 million, I
Yes.
don't know whether its price could have been 10 million or 15 million if a Western collector was allowed to bid and take it out of the country.
Or
Likewise,
it might have been
yeah,
less, because if you're getting this amazing, almost like gold medal prize from the Indian government, if that hadn't happened, there's also an argument that maybe they wouldn't have, if the prices abroad wouldn't have been boosted. But presumably, did the Indian government give any warning they were going to do this, or did it happen overnight?
no. So this Amrita Shergill that sold, it sold in Mumbai in an auction by an Indian auction house,
Sure.
and goes without saying that artwork would have been bought by an Indian collector,
Yes.
or it would stay in India after the auction. It would
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
changed hands,
No.
but geographically it was limited to here.
No.
And
What I
what
mean
it
is,
also does on the flip side, on the other side, is an Amrita Shergill which is already abroad before
yeah.
the rules came in. It
Well.
stays there,
Yeah.
and sort of. I think a lot of diaspora collectors or even Indian collectors, when they buy it, say in an auction in London or an auction in New York, may not want to bring it back to India because the moment they bring it back, they won't be able to take it
Take
out
it
and
out.
sell it again. So that sort of creates another barrier
That's really
apart
interesting.
from all the bureaucracy
Yeah.
and
And it,
logistics that is involved.
similar things have happened in Italy recently with the modern artists, with the with you know about that,
Right.
and suddenly their prices, the post-war artists' work started going up in price for the same reason, because suddenly they wouldn't be able to take them out the country if they're more than 50 years, I think, dead. I think it is. So, and
Right.
we see these heritage issues, in these patrimony issues
No,
in
I
a lot
think
of
it's
countries.
required also. Uh,
Yeah.
It's required also. I think the UK also has something where, a museum is allowed to match the price
Yeah.
achieved in auction,
Yeah, we have
and
the
it's
art
given a certain
funds that comes
period
into
of time.
operation,
Yeah.
and
So,
the government could put a 6-month export ban before allowing the money to be raised. Yeah. Oh,
right.
that's very interesting. So, I read your article on the about the Mumbai Art Fair that you wrote for ArtNet. Really, really interesting article. Great illustrations as well. And I think listeners, if they could go to that article, we'll put the link in the uh, on the podcast written material for them to read it, because there's some really good illustration. They can see some of the art that was selling at the Mumbai Art Fair. You've already said that Mumbai is where a lot of contemporary art scene is in
Right.
India. I think that's right. And is that also partly because is there a younger kind of working wealthy person in Mumbai maybe
Yeah.
compared to other cities?
Right. So I think it's partly to do with the culture of each of these cities.
Yep.
Mumbai is obviously benefited a lot more from the recent economic growth. It has driven that growth in sectors like finance,
Yes.
and a lot of them have come to work in the city in the
Yes.
90s or in the 2000s, in the last 20-25 years. So I think a lot of them are in their 30s and 40s now,
Yep.
and relatively speaking, they're younger collectors. Yeah, so I think the Mumbai Art Fair, uh, this was the first edition, the inaugural one, and therefore, in a sense, it was a beta test of sorts. The focus was decidedly domestic, not international. And I think the organizers played to their strengths. So around 50 galleries participated, which is relatively small compared to the global fairs. So the India Art Fair, for example, has 100 galleries. It's planned this year. The Art Basel Hong Kong, which is returning to a full strength version in March this year, I think it'll have more than 200 galleries, 230 to 35 galleries, if I remember
Mm-hmm.
right. So 50 galleries is a small number, but the good thing is that all the top domestic galleries, especially from Delhi and Mumbai, were represented,
Yep.
practically all of them.
Yep.
And the other good thing was that they demarcated a modern section and a contemporary section, sort of like Frieze, for example, with Frieze
Mm-hmm.
Masterpiece in London. And I think that helped the visitors also differentiate and navigate better. And I like the contemporary section more. It was more spacious, it was curated better, and different galleries adopted different strategies in terms of the number of artists, the
Mm-hmm.
density of works on display, the curation of the booth. And many of these galleries kept smaller works and works on paper to keep the entry point lower for newer buyers, because it was the first edition of an art fair in the city, and therefore, if new buyers came in who were not going to galleries, I think that was smart on their part.
That's a great
And the
strategy.
theme,
Just briefly to interrupt, that's almost the opposite of what happens with Freeze in London. That most of my students now, just to remind people, Anindo was at what year were you a student in London at the on the MA Art
uh,
Business?
2019,
2019. That's
2019, yeah.
right. And but they tend to say, "Oh, I much preferred masters. It was better organized, felt cooler space than the contemporary." Whereas you're saying in Mumbai, you felt that it was better curated, the contemporary compared to the masters section.
I think because there are more galleries focusing on masters,
Yeah.
and they had to accommodate them, it felt a little cramped. There were
Ah.
also some which were hybrid galleries or booths which were showcasing both
Yeah.
modern and contemporary works, so it felt a little confused.
Mm.
Uh, and yes, I mean, I felt it felt less dynamic, less fresh. Contemporary art, obviously, by design, feels
Yeah.
fresher. But I think going forward, either they should look for a larger space, or they should figure out a better way to curate. And I think in art fairs, layouts also add a lot to the experience, because you're experiencing so much art in such a
Yes.
short span of time. So I think the layout and the design of the booths, they also play a key role in how long you can survive in that environment without suffering from fatigue.
Yeah.
So I think uh,
Do you think this
those are
is this?
the, I mean, that's where I'm coming from. But yes, I've been to Freeze. So Freeze is a totally different context and environment. So again, not a like to like comparison. It's a much larger space also, sort of This was happening in Mahalakshmi Race Course, which is a very marquee location in Bombay, in South Bombay.
And they were temporary marquees as they are in London for the fair. It's a marquee
No,
or
so the modern was happening in a sort of inside a building.
in a building.
The contemporary one was set up. So it was not happening inside the race course. So it didn't have the greens. It was happening in the members enclosure, which is where a lot of members events
I
happen.
see. Yes.
So it was a temporary structure, and the space was much smaller relative to what you have in Freeze, say.
Why the race course? Is it there weren't any
No,
alternatives? Or
that's it's a very elitist space.
yeah,
But having
interesting.
said that, it's also a very premium space where a lot of high profile events happen.
Yeah.
People in the city know about that place, and it's centrally located. And South Mumbai is the traditional high income neighborhood of Mumbai. So for them, it is more accessible. It's sort of between South and Central Mumbai. So I think Mumbai is a city which is very difficult to navigate because of the traffic, and it's fairly narrow in terms of its topography. So I think they kept those things in consideration. But I think in the long term, as they grow, if they have to have 150 or 200 galleries 5 years or 10 years down the line, they might need a different location, or they need to be able to access more space within the Mahalakshmi race course.
So you think there will be more additions? It was generally a success.
Yeah. I think the Mumbai Art Fair will grow year on year. There's far too many tailwinds, macroeconomically, art market wise, and they have not even tapped into the international gallery base right now.
And did gallerists report good sales?
So galleries are very loath to share sales data, especially Indian galleries. And I was reporting it during the fair when a lot of sales is booked but not confirmed.
Yeah.
And there are other variables in play also. And it's the first edition. But suffice it to say, I took a lot of reads, and the sales performance was very good. So that's why galleries were in general happy. And I think because art market is buoyant, galleries are not that worried about sales, but it's about meeting new clients. And one of the organizers was actually the Saffron Art team, one of the founder members. So I think galleries realized that they could access the client base of Saffron Art.
Interesting.
Which is a very loyal base. Now, collectors will say, no, we go to both. We go to galleries as well as auction houses.
Yes.
But the reality is that that in India, there's a huge price arbitrage between auction houses and galleries. Galleries typically, especially primary sales, emerging artists sell at a much lower price point, and auction houses which sell market validated marquee artists sell at a much different price point. So in a Venn diagram, there'll obviously be an overlap.
Yeah.
But I think the galleries would have been fair to expect that they were going to meet new customers. Also, the gallery space is fairly inaccessible. They're usually sometimes by appointment, the doors are closed. A lot of people don't walk into a gallery because even in London, in Mayfair, for example, it took me a while before I got used to the fact that I can just walk in, because they're not really welcoming. But during the art fair, it just completely changes. So I think
agree.
that is the other factor.
I agree that, and it's nice that I think increasingly you're seeing more local galleries. I mean, obviously, a lot of this is to do with sustainability. There's a lot of discussions going on at the moment about our art fairs, ecologically.
Again, I think there's a very Western narrative, and it's completely irrelevant for India.
Oh, really?
In the West, you have a surfeit of art fairs. There are just too many art fairs, and they've crowded the calendar.
Yeah.
But the truth is, a country of India's size and economy has had only one art fair, and the main economic hub of the country did not have any art fairs. Common sense. If you notice, the tourist hotspots usually have the biennales, and the economy hotspots, whether it's a New York or a Miami or a London or a Paris, they have the art fairs. So for Mumbai not to have an art fair, I think was a major gap. And the carbon footprint and the sustainability aspect happens because you have people from the US jet setting to Basel, and then to Zonamaco, and then to Paris Blue, or to Arco in Madrid. and burning jet miles. But the Mumbai Art Fair was very clearly domestic in its focus. So I don't see again that being
Well,
relevant, at least to this edition.
before Anindo, before we talk about the India Art Fair, I was just you just mentioned Biennales biennials and the Kochi biennial. Do you call them biennales or biennials in India?
Yeah, that's a good spot.
Well, I'm always telling my
Uh,
students the Biennale is Venice. It's the
Correct.
Italian word, and
So,
really you should use biennial for other
right.
art biennials. Yeah.
So, so the Kochi Biennale is
Mm,
India's largest art event. It
sure.
was started in 2012,
Yep.
and it was inspired by the Venice Biennale.
Yes.
When the founders were envisioning it, formulating their ideas and plans and strategies. And that probably explains why they chose the Italian descriptor rather than biennial, which
Interesting.
one would expect because Italy was not the country who colonized us and influenced our language. So,
No, that's interesting.
biennial is what would have been expected. But so basically, the Kochi Biennale was a sort of coming together between the Kerala government, which is Kerala is the state where Kochi is located. It's on the
Hmm.
southern part of India. It had been a tourist hotspot, but it also wanted to become a cultural hotspot. And two Kerala-based artists, Malayali artists, which is the local artists there, uh, the government and spoke to the local art community and specifically these two artists, and they came up with the idea of starting a biennale.
Mm.
And it has been there for sort of 12 years now. In fact, I attended the last edition. I spent a week at the last edition rather when it happened in 2022-23.
Hmm.
So it has it has had a checkered past. So fundraising has always been an issue. It has been partly supported by the government, but a event of a Biennale scale needs a lot of fundraising. And in India, it's very difficult to raise money internationally because there are
Mm.
a lot of regulations, a lot of restrictions rather. If I am sitting in India and I want to raise, whether as an NGO or as an arts non-profit, I mean, and that's because these funds have been misused in the past. People have raised, got funds from outside, and let's say they have been either misused or used in ways which is not acceptable to the national government.
Sure.
You know, uh, terrorism is a major issue nowadays, so you have to track where funds are coming from and where they're going. That's an obvious reason.
Hmm.
Okay, but coming back to the art market, so the Kochi Biennale has had a struggle raising funds. Even in the edition in 2018, for example, after the event got over, vendors complained about not being paid for it. That issue continued till the start of the last edition.
Hmm.
Uh,
And
Even in the last
it's not a
edition,
commercial art fair, is it? It's like the Biennale. It's not
it is a
ostensibly.
Biennale.
Yeah.
In fact, it is a Biennale in every form and
Yeah.
format and in
So it's a
every way.
cultural, not financial enterprise anyway.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
it receives more than 600,000 visitors, which is a similar number as the Venice Biennale. Now, one
Fantastic.
can say that India is a country of a billion people, so it's not that difficult to get a 500,000 people. But I think that is not giving credit to the organizers
It's
because
incredible.
India may have a billion people, but the museums are still empty. The museum going culture is not as much there. And I think it's not India specific. I mean, I remember when I was in London, I was studying at Sotheby's. Even the British Museum gets 65% of their visitors pre-pandemic used to be international tourists.
Yes.
And then you had school groups and empty nesters. So, sort of so basically locals don't go to museums, but I think Kochi Biennale as an event has been able to market itself well, both to the local community as well as to the international tourist community who
Yeah.
come to Kerala during that period. And they've really transformed the cultural economy in Kochi, whether it's hotels, Airbnbs, cafes, restaurants,
Yeah.
and the ancillary industry which benefits from tourism and cultural events like these.
So similar really to Venice. And of course, Venice, a lot of people don't realize now, it was a commercial, it was an art fair
Right.
until the 60s when the students rebelled and said we should,
1967, I think. Yeah.
art shouldn't have a financial value. We're still to a certain extent living with that legacy of art
Yeah.
schools not
No,
liking to talk
I
about
did a
money.
case study. In fact, when I was, we had that case study to compare biennales and art fairs, if you
Yes, that's
remember.
right.
And yeah, I think it's an unsaid thing, but a lot of museum curators and even collectors do visit biennales to prospect works.
Of course.
Sometimes buy at that point and sometimes later, but I think
and you, I don't know whether did we go to Venice the year in 2019?
Yeah, of course we went.
You'll remember the famous phrase.
Yeah, we went to the art biennale, so we were lucky. We were the batch.
That's right,
who got
not
to
the
visit an art
architecture.
biennale.
Yeah. Well, we're going to the arts in June, and then we're going to take the next year's students to the same art fair in the art biennale in November. And then the next year, that next cohort will go in June, and so we managed to take each year now. It's just that one group goes in winter at the end, and the other goes in the summer. But
that's fantastic.
you might remember the "See it in Venice, buy it in Basel" is the phrase, which is why Basel Art Fair takes place so soon after the start of the Venice Biennale, which is an interesting kind of symbiosis. Really. And so coming on to the Indian Art Fair, which is the India Art Fair, which is about to take place in a different city in New Delhi. That's coming up now in early February, I understand. Would you like to compare and contrast that to Mumbai? And does that?
So I'll say very briefly. See, the Indian Art Fair is the preeminent art fair.
Yeah.
It started quite early, around 2008, 2009. And now it's getting into its 15th edition, like I was mentioning. And this year they have increased the number of galleries. They're relatively full strength after the pandemic. All art fairs missed a couple of years and beats. So they'll have about 100 galleries. And this year they've got, the new thing that they're doing is they've got a design section. So we're talking about the Venice Biennale. If you remember, we visited the Carpenter's Workshop exhibition, Carpenter's Workshop Gallery. They did a brilliant exhibition. I mean, it was one of my most memorable art exhibitions. And they work at the intersection of art and design and architecture. So it was in one of the palazzos next to the Grand Canal in Venice. So they are participating this year in collaboration with an Indian designer, co-curating the booth. So I think that is a thing. In terms of international galleries, there's Galleria Continua, which is San Gimignano, London, and outposts in Beijing and some places in the US, I think. But again, there are a few other international galleries, but like the ones Art Mumbai got, a lot of them are either diaspora run, or they focus on Indian or South Asian art, or they are, sort of Indian galleries that later move to an international location. So there is a strong Indian connection to some of these international galleries.
So what is the Indian connection for Continua?
Not for Continua. That's why I qualified and I mentioned Continua separately.
But they're
the other ones, like for example, the Icon Gallery is New York based, but it is founded, managed, run by people of Indian origin.
Yes, sure, but not Continua.
So, similarly, not Continua. So similarly, I said most of the other galleries is what I had said.
Oh, sorry.
Most of the other international galleries.
Did you say that Continua was at the India Art Fair or not?
Continua is coming to the Indian Art Fair.
Yeah. So they will be bringing non-Indian art.
So let me clarify. None of the Alpha galleries are coming.
Sure.
Amongst the better known international galleries, the one name that comes to my mind is Galleria Continua.
Continua, yeah.
Among the other international galleries, most of them have a strong Indian connection, either because they are founded by the diaspora or owned or managed. Some of them are based in New York, some of them are based in Dubai.
Yes.
Or they specialize in South Asian art. So again, it makes sense from the target market perspective.
Yes.
So for example, the Grosvenor Gallery in London in Mayfair that we used to go to, they used to have a lot of exhibitions on Indian and South Asian art.
Sure.
So they were present in the Art Mumbai, and they'll be there in the India Art Fair as well. So they're not Indian owned, but they focus on South Asian art.
Sure.
Whereas an Icon Gallery is Indian owned and
have built up a big client base of Indian collectors, presumably.
Correct.
Yeah. Anindo, I'm just looking at the time. I think that this might have happened last time we did a podcast with you. I think
Right.
there were some more things we wanted to talk about, but I wondered whether we could bring it to a close now.
My
And
suggestion is you can edit out a little bit on the introduction if you wish to, and then add maybe 10 minutes here or 5 minutes here, and we can wrap up.
well, no, I think it would be good to do another one, maybe following the. Are you going to the India Art Fair? Will you be?
I
Will you be
might go. As of now, I'm slated to go, but I have something else to also cover. So because I'm actually going for the Colombo Scope in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, and then there's the Gaul Literature Festival. So I'm pretty much traveling till the end of this month. So
interesting?
that's a long.
I think there's another podcast though that we should do. I think that the listeners would really like to know about
Yeah.
the
Yeah, we
the
can. I
emerging
think the areas that
emerging
we've
Indian
not
artists.
covered are on the institutional side, the wider art ecosystem. So the museums, the foundations, as well as the artists.
I think
I
the
think,
emerging
and the role of
artists.
the government, for example, which I think is key in a country like India.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think we'll have a part two then. So we'll work following the podcast. I'll let the listeners know.
those are the things we could focus on, yes. To
Yeah, no,
make
because we
the, so
haven't
it could be a
scratched.
2 series thing, but it will be comprehensive on the Indian art market and the Indian art ecosystem. So I think some of your students, if they want to get deeper for their dissertation, or some of the
Yeah,
recent pass outs, if they're trying to focus on that, on this
yeah.
market, I think they could approach it that way. Yeah.
And some of our current students they don't know it yet, but we're going to introduce them to an optional activity whereby we pair them up with emerging Indian artists who are part of this the Arts Family Art Prize, which is run
Okay.
by Neha Jaiswal, who's another Sotheby's Institute London MA Art Business alumnus. So that I think that those people will be therefore interested in us having a conversation about who's hot, who's not amongst the maybe the younger, more emerging Indian artists. I think that would make a really good focus for the next podcast.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Anyway, I'd like
Yeah.
to thank you
Sounds
very
good.
much, Anindo, for joining us today. And it's very, very exciting. This is the start of the new year and the first podcast of the new year. And I think it's really, really interesting. And I think very nice for us in the Northern Hemisphere and in the West in winter to talk about these, what we see as exotic places, which has always, I think, been obviously an attraction, I think, for Western
Right.
collectors, that to buy what they see as exotic art and from a place that they'd really like to be in and go to. I guess that's it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Indian art, especially contemporary art, is far more globalized,
Yep.
and a lot of research based. And what I like about, we've spoken more about the market side of things, but I think in terms of creative practice, in terms of creative process, and in terms of the materiality, what I really like about what's happening in contemporary art is there's a lot of research based practice, which is closely uh, embedded in the socio-cultural issues,
Absolutely.
which makes the art really meaningful conceptually, but also uh, a lot of the works are they have great aesthetic value as well. So just because they're research based doesn't mean that the presentation is not great, which is usually, getting both right is a challenge. I think that's there. And there's a lot of younger artists, women artists, and artists who were not as represented earlier. They're finding a voice
Sure.
in terms of materials.
That's happening
There's
in
a lot
London
of,
as well.
and I
Yeah.
think a lot of younger galleries are also helping.
Yeah.
Especially the contemporary art galleries, there are a lot of younger galleries who've come in,
Yeah.
and their approach to curation is obviously far more dynamic and inclusive.
Yeah,
So I
it's
think those things are
happening
helping.
with London art schools and artists. There's more of those art school artists now appearing in the big commercial
Right.
contemporary galleries in Mayfair. I just
And I
wanted
think
to
a
finish.
final point before we segue into the whenever we do the next episode is that uh, a lot of artists are now getting institutional recognition also,
Sure,
which was lacking
absolutely.
earlier. So
Yeah,
I think that is what gives them an opportunity to practice outside the diktat of the art market.
yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's important.
Just briefly, Jitish Kalat. So there's an Indian contemporary artist, Jitish Kalat.
Correct.
Am I pronouncing it
Yeah,
right?
we saw his work at the
In
Venice
Somerset
Biennale in
House.
2019.
Yeah.
If you remember, we saw his work at the India Pavilion in the Venice Biennale in
that's right.
2019.
Yep.
The center installation where you had the Gandhi's letter that he wrote to Hitler.
That's the one.
Yeah, and it was a hit with all our
with
classmates
all
also.
the
Everybody
students.
spent a lot of time there.
But
Yeah.
recently, even the current students might have seen his work in the courtyard of Somerset House on the river in London, where he had these fantastic spirals that were made up of British motorway blue background signs. And it's all about sustainability, and I think he's touring the work and he's showing it underwater in an Indian archaeological site. It's all going to be recycled afterwards. So he's hitting all of the kind of ticking all the right boxes really in terms of sustainability and contemporary art, and very easy to look at, very easy to experience, very beautiful.
Right, he's one of the contemporary artists at the forefront.
Anyway, we will talk about Jitish Kalat and other artists and less well-known emerging artists in our next podcast. So thank you very much, Anindo.
Look forward to that.